My name is Meher. I'm 30 years old, and the day my father signed a do not resuscitate order to save money was the day I stopped being his daughter. It was raining outside the private hospital, the kind of slow gray rain that makes the world feel suspended. Inside ICU room 407, my mother was hooked to machines that breathed and blinked for her. Cardiac arrest. Sudden. Brutal. The cardiologist stood at the foot of the bed, speaking gently. If her heart stops again, we can attempt full resuscitation, but we need consent. There are risks. And costs. Costs. I saw it happen. The flicker in my father's eyes. Not fear, not grief. Calculation. How much are we talking about? He asked. I stared at him. Abu. The doctor gave a number range. It was high, but we weren't struggling. My father owned 2 textile factories, several warehouses, and half the commercial plaza in our city. Money was his language, his religion. He nodded slowly. She wouldn't want to live dependent on machines, he said. She's not even conscious, I snapped. He didn't look at my mother. He looked at the clipboard. And then he signed. The scratch of his pen across paper felt louder than the heart monitor. Do not resuscitate. I felt something cold settle inside my chest. You're doing this for money, I whispered. He finally met my eyes. I'm doing this because we have to think long term. One emotional decision can destroy years of hard work. Hard work. 35 years of marriage reduced to a business liability. I walked out of the ICU before I broke down in front of him. But I didn't cry. I planned. Because my father made one fatal mistake. He forgot who structured his empire. For the past 5 years, I had been the quiet daughter, working in his corporate office. MBA, finance director. The one who modernized accounting, digitized contracts, negotiated supplier renewals. He loved telling people, my daughter is brilliant with numbers. He never realized I understood power even better. 3 years ago, during an expansion phase, he transferred 51% temporary shareholding of one logistics subsidiary into my name. It was for tax optimization and government bidding eligibility. He always said, we'll transfer it back later. He never did. That subsidiary controlled distribution for both factories, which meant it controlled cash flow. For 48 hours after he signed the DNR, I did nothing publicly. I stayed at the hospital, sat beside my mother, held her hand. Her skin felt warm but fragile. Machines breathed in rhythm. I leaned close to her ear. Ami, I won't let him choose profit over you. On the 3rd morning, 72 hours after that signature, I went to the office. I wore white, calm, composed. At 9 a.m., I called an emergency board meeting for the logistics subsidiary. Agenda: operational restructuring due to financial risk exposure. At 10:15 a.m., I signed new internal policies suspending intercompany credit extensions to my father's main manufacturing entity. Translation: no more deferred payments, no more flexible transfers. Everything due immediately. By noon, the main factory's accounts department was in chaos. Raw material suppliers hadn't been paid in full because funds were always cycled strategically. Now the cycle was broken. At 2 p.m., I sent formal notice requiring outstanding balances cleared within 7 days, or distribution services would be halted under breach of contract clauses. Legally airtight. At 4 p.m., my father stormed into my office. What have you done? His voice shook, not with sadness, with panic. I closed my laptop slowly. Risk management. You froze internal credit lines. Yes. That will cripple operations. I tilted my head. One emotional decision can destroy years of hard work, remember? His face darkened. This is about your mother. Yes, I said softly. It is. You're blackmailing me? No, I'm protecting assets. His empire had always been built on leverage, loans, rotating capital, aggressive expansion. Without smooth internal transfers, banks would start asking questions. Suppliers would tighten terms. Margins would bleed. And he knew it. You think you can run this better than me? He demanded. I know I value human life more than inventory. Silence fell between us. For the first time in my life, my father looked uncertain. That night, he received 2 calls from creditors. The next morning, the bank requested updated liquidity statements. Pressure builds fast when foundations are exposed. By hour 70, he returned to the hospital. His steps slower. The cardiologist approached us again. There's instability. If another cardiac event happens, without resuscitation authorization, he didn't finish. I looked at my father. This ends now. He stared at the floor tiles. Revoke the DNR, I said calmly. Or I escalate restructuring to full asset separation. Permanently. It wasn't a threat. It was math. He understood math. His jaw tightened. Pride fighting survival. You would destroy your own family? I stepped closer. You already tried to. The monitor behind us beeped steadily. Tick, tick, tick. Finally, he exhaled. Bring the form. He signed again. This time not to save money, but to stop losing it. Within hours, I restored partial credit lines, but under revised authority. Mine. For the first time, I controlled operational approvals. Power doesn't need to shout. It just shifts. 2 days later, my mother's condition stabilized slightly. Not a miracle, but hope. When she opened her eyes briefly, weak and confused, I held her hand and smiled. You're safe, I whispered. Across the room, my father stood smaller than I'd ever seen him. In 72 hours, he hadn't lost everything financially, but he had lost something far more valuable: control. And this? This was only the beginning. Because when a daughter realizes her father values money over her mother's heartbeat, she doesn't just rebel, she recalculates. The morning after my father revoked the DNR, the hospital felt different. Not softer, not warmer, just tense. Because now it wasn't only my mother fighting for her life, it was my father fighting to keep his empire from collapsing. And I was standing in the middle of both battlefields. At 8:12 a.m., my phone buzzed. CFO, suppliers demanding advance payment. Bank requesting emergency review meeting. Production slowdown risk within 72 hours. 72 hours. Funny how life keeps measuring itself in that number. I stepped out into the hospital corridor and called the bank manager directly. Yes, I said calmly. There have been temporary internal liquidity adjustments. No, there is no insolvency. Yes, I'm authorized to speak on behalf of logistics. I let that word sit. Authorized. Because legally, I wasn't acting in rebellion anymore. I was acting in control. By noon, I had implemented Phase 2, not destruction, separation. I began isolating the logistics subsidiary's assets from the parent manufacturing company. Different legal protections, different cash reserves, different risk profiles. My father built everything interconnected, like veins feeding one heart. I was quietly creating 2 hearts. At 3 p.m., he called me into his office at the factory. The room smelled like polished wood and authority. You're overstepping, he said without greeting. No, I replied. I'm stabilizing. You're humiliating me in front of lenders. You humiliated yourself in front of your wife's hospital bed. His jaw tightened. You think this makes you powerful? He asked. I didn't raise my voice. No, it makes me responsible. He leaned back in his chair, studying me like I was a stranger. Maybe I was. You've always been emotional, he muttered. I almost laughed. Emotion would have been screaming. Emotion would have been public accusations. What I was doing was surgical. That evening, I requested a full audit of the manufacturing company's outstanding debts. The numbers were worse than I expected. Aggressive expansion, heavy leverage, optimistic projections. If one major contract faltered, the entire structure would shake. And suddenly, I understood something terrifying. My father hadn't just signed the DNR to save money. He was scared, not of losing my mother, of losing control while already financially exposed. He didn't want massive hospital bills on top of fragile liquidity. So he chose the cheapest solution. Her silence. That realization didn't soften me. It sharpened me. Because fear-driven leadership is dangerous. And I would not let his fear decide my mother's fate. The next morning, everything changed. One of the factories received notice, a government contract under review due to delayed material shipments. Delayed because I had frozen credit transfers. The irony wasn't lost on me. At 11:30 a.m., my father burst into the hospital room itself. "Call them," he hissed. "Restore full operational support now." My mother lay unconscious between us. I stood slowly. "Lower your voice. This contract funds half our quarterly revenue." "And her heart funds my entire existence," I replied quietly. He stared at me, rage simmering. "If we lose this contract, layoffs will follow." There it was. Collateral damage. I held his gaze. "Then maybe you should have thought about long-term consequences before gambling with her life." Silence filled the room except for the steady beep of the monitor. Finally, I stepped into the hallway. "I will partially restore distribution," I said, "but under new terms." "What terms?" he demanded. "Board restructuring." His eyes narrowed. "You want a seat on the parent company board. I want voting power proportional to operational risk. You're asking to dethrone me. I'm asking to prevent future DNR signatures made for financial convenience." He didn't respond immediately, because he knew I was right. By evening, an emergency board session was scheduled. For the first time in company history, my father would not walk in as unquestioned authority. He would walk in needing my vote. That night, I sat beside my mother again. Her fingers twitched slightly when I held them. "I'm not doing this to destroy him," I whispered. "I'm doing this to protect you." For years, she had stayed silent during his financial obsessions, ignored small emotional absences, accepted that business always came first. Now business was bowing. The board meeting the next morning was explosive. 2 external directors sided with me after reviewing liquidity risk. 1 abstained. My father voted against restructuring. The final count? 3-1. Board expansion approved. Operational Oversight Committee formed. And I was appointed co-executive director. Not his assistant. Not his daughter in the background. His equal. When the meeting ended, he didn't look at me. But I saw it. Not just anger, not just pride wounded. Fear of losing the version of the world he controlled completely. Back at the hospital that afternoon, the cardiologist approached us again. "She's responding to treatment better than expected." My chest tightened. "How much better?" I asked. Cautiously optimistic. Cautiously optimistic. 3 words that cost my father more than any invoice ever could. Because in less than a week, he had lost. Unchecked authority, financial opacity, absolute control. And he knew something else now. If he ever tried to reduce my mother's life to a balance sheet again, I wouldn't freeze accounts. I would dismantle the entire structure. But this still wasn't the end. Because power shifts create enemies. And my father had spent decades building a network of allies who did not appreciate a daughter rewriting the rules. As I stood by the ICU window that evening, watching rain slide down the glass, my phone vibrated again. Unknown number. I answered. A calm male voice spoke. "You've made powerful people uncomfortable, Ms. Mayer." I didn't speak. You might want to reconsider how far you're willing to go. The line went dead. I stared at my reflection in the darkened glass. This was no longer just about a DNR. It was about inheritance. Not of money, but of power. And someone had just made it clear. The next 72 hours would not be quiet. The call stayed in my head all night. You've made powerful people uncomfortable. Good. For 30 years, powerful people had been comfortable while my mother swallowed her opinions, and my father signed documents like God had appointed him CFO of human life. But this time, I wasn't swallowing anything. The next morning, I arrived at the factory before my father. Whispers followed me down the hallway. Staff had already heard about the board vote. Co-executive director, the daughter who challenged him. They didn't know the half of it. By 9 a.m., I had a full internal audit report printed and highlighted. Not just surface numbers, hidden liabilities, short-term loans disguised as supplier advances, inflated asset valuations used to secure larger credit lines. My father hadn't just built an empire, he had built a balancing act, and one strong wind could tip it. At 10:17 a.m., the strong wind arrived. The bank. Formal notice, immediate collateral reassessment due to structural leadership change and liquidity irregularities. Translation? They were nervous, and nervous banks are dangerous. My father read the email twice. His hands were steady, but his jaw wasn't. "This is because of you," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "This is because of years of overextension." He didn't argue, because he knew. The government contract was officially suspended by noon pending financial review. Investors began calling. 2 minority shareholders demanded emergency clarification. By 2 p.m., news had spread beyond the company. Competitors sensed blood. And then came the final blow. One of our largest raw material suppliers withdrew 30-day credit terms. Immediate payment only. The system was choking. My father sat in his office, staring at spreadsheets like they had betrayed him. I walked in and closed the door. "We can still stabilize," I said calmly. He didn't look up. "At what cost?" "Transparency. Asset downsizing. Personal guarantees withdrawn. Full restructuring." He finally lifted his eyes. "You want me to surrender. I want you to survive." Silence stretched between us. For the first time in my life, he didn't look like a titan. He looked tired. "Do you hate me?" he asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. I thought about ICU room 407. About the sound of pen on paper. "No," I said honestly. "But I will never forget what you almost did." His shoulders dropped slightly. At 5:40 p.m., the hospital called. My mother was awake, fully conscious. I didn't wait for the elevator. I ran down the stairs like I was 10 years old again. When I entered her room, her eyes were open, weak, tired, but aware. "Ami," I whispered, grabbing her hand. She smiled faintly. I heard arguing. She murmured softly. I swallowed a shaky laugh. "You always do." My father stepped in slowly behind me. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then she looked at him, and in that look was something heavier than anger. Disappointment. "You chose money?" she asked, voice fragile but clear. He couldn't meet her eyes. "I was afraid," he admitted. That was the first honest sentence he'd spoken in days. She squeezed my hand gently. "I married a man," she said quietly. "Not a balance sheet." The words hit harder than anything I'd done. He stepped closer to the bed. "I was wrong. Simple. Direct. No defense. It didn't erase the signature, but it changed something." Over the next week, we made decisions together. Not emotionally, strategically. 3 warehouses sold. 1 factory merged with a competitor under shared equity instead of debt.